So I'm going to be talking about Laysan and my time there. And I actually spent 4 months on Laysan. So of course the first question you might have is where and perhaps what is Laysan? Laysan is perhaps the most remote piece of land on planet Earth. You can see at this red dot here, it is pretty much equidistant between Asia and North America. And it's actually part of the Northwestern Hawaiian Island chain. So there's sort of another face to Hawaii that most people don't hear about. Going from north from the main islands, you have this scattered chain of tiny islets, rocky cliffs, and atolls, stretching for about 2,000 kilometers to the northwest. And these are, in fact, the elder siblings of the main Hawaiian Islands. On the big island there, you actually have a volcanic hotspot. And so it's an island factory. You can imagine it as if you're holding an acetylene torch against the roof or the floor of a slowly moving train. So as the island is pushed up the volcanic activity due to continental drift, it slides to the northwest, slowly shrinks down. That's why the further north and west you get in the main Hawaiian chain, the smaller the islands are. And then it drifts into the northwestern Hawaiian Island chain, where by that point, pretty much no island is over 1,000 acres in size, so no bigger pretty much than Stanley Park. And those islands will keep on drifting, and as they get further north, the actual island itself gets eroded away and is replaced by corals growing. So Laysan herself is actually built pretty much entirely at the surface level out of crushed coral, and that continues until they get north of the Darwin line, whereby past which coral cannot grow, and they just sink below the surface of the ocean and join the chain of the Emperor Sea Mountains, which is actually the largest mountain chain on planet Earth. The Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are a place of incredible cultural importance for traditional Hawaiian culture. They have a deep mythic and religious significance. According to many of their myth cycles, they are where life began in the universe and still maintain their position as the home of the gods and where many people, especially indigenous Hawaiians, go when they die. So they are a place where the mythic, religious, and divine world is still very much a part of the real world to traditional Hawaiian cosmology. And I can attest to spending 4 months there that this is one of the more accurate religious statements that I've ever heard. I think it's pretty much true. And the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are an incomparable marine resource. They're actually part of the largest marine protected area on planet Earth. They're home to about 10 million seabirds, and the sheer amount of fish, density of fish in the Northwesterns, is about 3 times that of the main Hawaiian Islands. So they're a critical treasure on planet Earth, and none more so than Laysan. Laysan is considered to be the crown jewel of these islands. She is the largest of the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands and the most biologically diverse. You can see she's got this incredible salt lake in the middle, which is actually home to a big collection of brine shrimp. She's about 1,000 acres in size, so about the size of Stanley Park, but she's got about 145,000 acres of surrounding coral reef. So the majority of this island is just below the sea, and she is one of the great bird Edens of planet Earth. So Laysan is home to 2 million breeding seabirds. So if you can imagine the entire population of the lower mainland crammed into an area of the size of Stanley Park, you can get some understanding of what it's like to be there. And they just infest the island from underground, pretty much on every single surface up. So the entire island is just a honeycomb of seabird burrows. On the ground level, as you can see, it's covered in nesting albatrosses and boobies and terns, and then any shrub, any elevated surface is home to the next class of seabird, the frigate birds, other boobies, other kinds of terns are nesting at every available surface there. To be on Laysan is just to be at the center of this incredible hub. It just booms with noise. It overflows with activity. It's a pretty overwhelming experience. The island itself is, for a large part of it, is sort of grassy with a bunch of other associated shrubs, and then has all these deep cuts where the coral reef comes into the island. You can see just in the top there, that's actually our camp. That's the collection of tents we had on that island. And that is there as the ironwood tree, which is not a native tree, but it was planted about 100 years ago on Laysan. And at this point, it's actually the only tree of any size that remains on the island. In the center of the island, where the salt lake is, you have a really vibrant wetland. That's where a lot of Laysan's rare and endangered plants are. There are plants there found pretty much nowhere else on Earth. And it's this beautiful sort of viney jungle of island morning glories and all sorts of really beautiful shrubs. And it's an incredibly rich place for the birds. You can see the various albatrosses all flying around there and the frigate bird up there. To the eastern portion of the island is where you have this rich landscape of coral towers and plateaus and tidal pools. It's quite an enchanted area, and that forms the rockier eastern wall of the island. And to the north is what we affectionately call the desert. The desert is about maybe 20% of Laysan's land area, and it is really a lasting monument to the legacy, the primary legacy of humans on Laysan. Laysan was used widely at the beginning of the 20th century for people slaughtered the albatross for feathers and mined the island for bird guano, which is used as fertilizer. And they also introduced rabbits to the island, which after only a few decades had completely denuded it. The island of Laysan was reduced to being pretty much this. In the course of that, they lost almost all of their native songbirds. Songbirds were found nowhere else on Earth, as well as the native Laysan rail, which is from nowhere else on Earth. And it was just pretty much a biological holocaust. Since then, the rabbits have been removed, and Laysan has been slowly rebuilding. Yet here in the desert, we can still see this lasting impact, which continues to this day. And a big part of our work was an attempt to mitigate and reverse some of that damage. It's a work that's been about a century in undertaking. This is our camp. So these were our individual little tents. This was our hurricane shelter. This was our kitchen tent here, so that's where we ate. And this was, pretty much our home on the island. And this is just a classic snapshot of Laysan. So you can see there's 7 or 8 kinds of seabirds right there. There's a Laysan albatross there, a black-footed there, a red-footed booby there, a black noddy there, a great frigate bird, some brown noddies. So just a classic snapshot of just the sheer richness and diversity of bird life there. And it was a pretty spectacular and isolating place to be, about halfway between North America and Asia. There's some fairy terns sitting on our fence or on our side. So this was us, and we were working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So these 2 ladies here were actually doing a study on the endangered miller birds on Laysan. So we'll talk more about that later. And this 7 of us, for that entire 4 months, were the only humans we really had any contact with. No internet. We had a satellite phone that we could very rarely use. We never saw pretty much another human in that time. So this was the whole of our human community. And we were pretty integrated into life on Laysan. We had to bring all of our food and all of our water with us. We didn't have boats coming to visit us, so you never quite realize how much water you end up drinking in 4 months until you have to carry it all. So the first day we arrived was just spending hours and hours trucking hundreds and hundreds of pounds, thousands of pounds of water up the beach, as well as all of our food. And then in our lagoon was where we did all of our bathing and even all of our washing of our dishes with biodegradable soap. So this was the human community on Laysan. Pretty small, pretty limited. But the bird community is what I really want to talk about today. And this is sort of the flagship bird of Laysan. This is the spectacular Laysan albatross. And this is a bird that belongs to one of the more prominent groups of seabirds, which are called tube noses. So you can see there's a little kind of tube coming down the snout there. And that helps them in getting rid of excess salt, so they can actually drink seawater. And all tube noses, unlike a lot of birds, actually have a really amazing sense of smell. So that's one of their primary ways that they navigate and find food, which is pretty unique in the bird world. And albatrosses, this is pretty much an albatross's life most of the time. They are incomparable wanderers. The Laysan albatross, even though they breed in tropical Hawaii, actually spend most of their time feeding in the Bering Sea, so around Alaska, northern Japan, Russia. They do actually wander down the BC coast. Just last spring, I saw one just off the coast of Ipuit. You could see it just flying against the mountains of Vancouver Island, which was pretty astonishing. but generally they're further west in the Pacific. And these are animals. They're, in fact, considered to be the longest lived bird that we know of on Earth. The longest, the current oldest bird that anyone has measured its age is a Laysan albatross who lives on Midway. Her name is Wisdom, and she's actually 64 years old and just had a chick just last year, so she's still going strong. And they will spend most of their time in flight. In fact, it's no illusion that their flight seems effortless. For an albatross, their heart rate is actually lower when they're flying than when they're sitting on an egg. So for them, their natural state, the most easy, effortless position for them to be in, is just like that, flying on those immense wings. They have a wingspan of about 6 or 7 feet. So pretty big by our standards, but that's tiny compared to the wandering royal albatrosses of the Southern Ocean that have a wingspan more like 10 or 11 feet or 3 meters long. So they're an incredible traveler. And what's amazing is they're wandering, but they're not lost. Any given Laysan albatross will have an incredible knowledge of the ocean, places where there are upwellings or areas of higher feeding ability, so richer areas of the ocean. And of course, wherever they are, they know exactly where their breeding island is. So Laysan's about 1,000 acres. It's a tiny little dot, a little coral scab in the middle of the hugest ocean on the planet. And yet, if you took an albatross off Laysan, put it, because people have done this, put it in a jet, took it out to, say, the coast of Washington or the coast of Japan or the Philippines, it would know exactly where it was and be able to find its way back to Laysan within less than a week, pretty much. So their knowledge of the ocean is incomparable. And that is, based, obviously, they have an incredible instinctual toolkit, but it's also based on their experiences. These are incredibly long-lived birds, and they don't actually breed until they're about 8 or 9 years ool. And they won't touch land usually until they're about 3 or 4 once they leave the nest. And that's one of the reasons is because to gain that level of experience, to be able to be an effective forager in such a vast environment, just takes a huge amount of investment of their time. However, on Laysan is one of those few places where you see these animals of the open ocean on land. And this is something that we saw all the time. And this is part of the courtship dance of Laysan albatross. It's one of the most elaborate breeding behaviors of any animal on Earth, including humans. And it's pretty amazing to see. It's very hard to describe. It's this incredible range of bows and sort of curtsies. They sort of neck each other as well. They're constantly showing off their wings, and then they sort of concludes when they raise their necks up, stand on their tiptoes, you can see there, and they do this kind of deep bovine moo. And this guy is doing this rapid fire clatter of his bill, or her bill, which sort of accompanies that movement. So it's a very elaborate dance, and it's very hard to really understand or explain it. But it's a series of maybe 9, 10, or 11, or 12 stereotype movements done in synchrony and also in complement to each other. And they'll be working on that for years. So when they first come back to the colony when they're 4, they're not very good at it. It actually takes them years to be able to learn how to dance properly and find a mate. So they may start looking for one when they're 3 or 4, and over the course of years, they've got a closer and closer relationship with one bird, and maybe in the last couple of years before they breed, they'll only be dancing with this one partner as they slowly make that decision that they'll actually carry for the rest of their lives. These animals are monogamous, so when they've got that mate when they're 10, they will return to each other year after year for maybe the next 60 years. So every fall on Laysan, you have these albatrosses coming in off the ocean, and they'll know that mate maybe they haven't seen for an entire year. They've been wandering across the entire Pacific, and they'll just settle right down together. It's a pretty astonishing thing. The other kind of albatross that's quite common in Laysan is the blackfin albatross. And I have a lot of affection for these guys because these really are the BC albatross. Laysans usually, as I said, forage out more towards Japan and Russia. These guys are abundant right here off the coast of BC and off California. So if you take any sort of boat, maybe 40 kilometers offshore, west side of Vancouver Island, you're almost guaranteed to see these guys out there. And they're a very spectacular albatross. A lot of the seabirds I'm going to talk about have a pretty wide breeding range across the tropical Pacific. But when it comes to these two, the Laysan and the Blackfoot, they're almost entirely confined to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So that really is their kingdom. It's the core of their entire culture and their entire life history. These are the two North Pacific albatrosses that most of us or most people know about if they know about any. But there's actually a third one I saw on Laysan, and that's this one here. This is the incredibly spectacular Stellars, or short-tailed albatross. And you can see just how thoroughly it dwarfs the Laysan beside it. So as I said, that Laysan, as you can see in the one here, it's a pretty big bird. It's got a wingspan about 6 or 7 feet, so it's about the size of a bald eagle. And you can just see how much more massive a Stellar's albatross is. In fact, that bird is the largest seabird in the entire northern hemisphere. So it's a pretty impressive critter. And I call it the Stellar's albatross, even though some people call it the short-tail. The both names are correct. But the reason why I sort of choose that is because it says something very important about that bird's life history. And I want to ask you folks, anyone here ever heard or seen a Stellar's jay? Anyone? Almost all of you. Great, that's great. Most people call them blue jays. So. How about a Stellar sea lion? Yeah, so these are both animals. They got the name Stellar in them, which honors the great Russian naturalist, can't remember his first name, his last name was Stellar, Dr. Stellar, who traveled to the North Pacific. He's one of the first people from Europe to travel to the North Pacific, and he named a lot of our animals. And so when you hear the name Stellar, that's a strong implication. That is an animal that belongs to us. That is part of our distinct marine or terrestrial community here on the West Coast. So when I call that bird a Stellar's albatross, I think that's important because it acknowledges that. We saw how many people had seen Stellar's jays, how many people had seen Stellar's sea lions. How many people here have ever seen a Stellar's albatross? Right. Well, there's an excellent reason for that, because that shouldn't be the case. This actually was the most abundant albatross in the entire North Pacific. There were 5 million of these guys about 100 years ago. And they, unlike the Laysan and the black-footed who prefer the open ocean, this is actually an inshore albatross. They were found right here in the Strait of Georgia, Strait of Juan de Fuca. They were quite abundant. In fact, there's even some tantalizing evidence these guys bred on Triangle Island, just off the coast of BC. So 100 years ago, if you were crossing the ferry to Vancouver Island, it's entirely likely you would be seeing these massive birds with an 8-foot wingspan just following the ferry. The fact that we don't see that points to a story that very few people are aware of, which is that these guys were almost completely exterminated. In fact, from the period between the 30s and the 40s, this bird is believed to have vanished from the face of the earth. So once the most abundant albatross, the largest, and some say the most spectacular seabird in the North Pacific, almost wiped out. They were reduced to about 400 individuals, and now they're up to about 2,100. So certainly rising, but still, the fact that you don't see that, the fact that that is not as familiar to you as a Stellar's jay or a Stellar's sea lion is the mark of a wound to our coast and to our coastal community here that most of us don't even know is there. There's a hole in nature with an 8-foot wingspan and this glorious golden mane, and it's a hole that none of us are even aware of. So that is a pretty important thing. This photo was taken on Midway, where there are actually 2 of them, and they do breed, and there is one on Laysan. They believe it's a male. He's been there for about a decade. He comes back every single year, and he's never found a mate. So he just waits in a single spot. He actually sometimes tries to adopt maybe other albatrosses. But because really it takes 2 to raise a baby, that's why their pair bond is so essential, because it's a huge amount of labor and work for them to do it. They never make it. He could wait for the next 60 years until a female finally shows up to share his territory with him. Now these guys are rising in their population, so it's entirely possible that maybe, if we keep up our end of the bargain and keep a healthy ocean, maybe in 30 or 40 years, you might be riding a ferry and see one of these amazing animals again. So those are the albatrosses, and there he is, flying into the sunset. And they're the massive side of the tube noses. The other side of that group are the shearwaters and the petrels. So they still have that same little tube thing there, so you know they're close cousins, but they're only about this big. And these guys are incredibly abundant on Laysan. This is the wedge-tailed shearwater, and this is the Christmas shearwater. And these guys are nocturnal, and they were a big presence because of their calls. They produce this incredible array of caterwauling. That's these sort of moans and groans. It's almost like, it's compared to restless spirits before. So there's this ghostly choir everywhere on Laysan. There's hundreds of thousands of these guys every night, and it's combined with the voices of the bone-and petrel. So these guys have this kind of growling voice. They're almost totally nocturnal, which is why I never got an adult. This is actually a young bird, so he still has the fuzzy head there. The adults come in hundreds of thousands at night onto the island around sunset. And the bulrus petrel, who are really adorable. They're only about this big, but they have this really deep voice that sounds like a big dog, like sort of like a mastiff. So to imagine what the nocturnal scene on Laysan is like, is you're lying in your tent, and the air is just pierced by these shrieks, howls, and moans from the shearwaters, these sort of little growling sounds from the bonin petrels, and these deep like woof, woof, woof from these tiny little guys all over the beach. So it's got this sort of unearthly cacophony to it. Once again, sort of reminding you that this is an area that is steeped in myth, that for the culture, indigenous cultures of the area, has an enormous significance from a spiritual perspective as well. And that sort of brings that home. And once again, this guy has that little tube there, so even though he's this big, he's still closely related to that massive Steller's albatross of the North Pacific. So that's the tube noses. The next group, all those guys, the shearwaters and the petrels, they're burrowers. So as I mentioned before, the entire surface of Laysan is a giant honeycomb. If you were to step outside of our camp or off one of our trails, you would almost immediately think up about to your knee in the burrows of one of these seabirds. And if you do that, you got to dig it out because otherwise the poor little guy is little baby chicken there is going to suffocate. So whenever we were doing our restoration work on the island, we were just constantly digging out burrows that we just accidentally collapsed to rescue the little chicks or the adults who were inside. So the density of birds on Laysan actually makes it hard to move. It's pretty incredible. So the next group are the pelecaniforms. This is a very ancient group. They date back to about the Cretaceous period. So they're one of the elder groups of birds on the planet. And this is another aerial master like the albatross. This is a great frigate bird. But they take that aerial mastery to a different extreme. Obviously, they've got a sort of a sinister appeal. The one I first saw looked like almost like a pirate flag floating in the air. They're almost weightless. In fact, their feathers weigh considerably more than their bones. So to see a frigate bird in the air is almost like seeing like a floating razor blade. Like they're incredibly well adapted for it. But when you see them on land, they give a bit of a different impression. So this is a frigate bird feeling attractive. The males inflate this gular patch here. And then when a female would fly over, they'd all put their heads back, raise their wings, and do what I can only really describe as this high-pitched yodeling. So it's this long, bizarre, bubbling trill, which apparently is irresistible. And the frigate birds are famed for being kleptoparasites, which means that they take food from other birds. This reputation has been a bit overemphasized, but if you spend any time with frigate birds, they're a really intimidating presence. This picture was actually taken with a wide-angle lens. So the camera was out as far as it could possibly be. This frigate bird was in my face. They have a wingspan about the size of a bald eagle, and their bills are about this long. And so when one is about this far from your face, it's really intimidating. In fact, I had them push me into the ground. And because they're such master flyers, they can just hover in front of you, and every inch you move, they'll just push an inch. It's incredible. And they use that incredible maneuverability in chasing down other birds. So you'll see frequently when a tropic bird or a booby is coming back to Laysan with food for its chick, maybe 3 or 4 frigate birds will swoop out of the sky and chase it down and force it to disgorge its prey so they can just snatch it out of the air. And I've seen them chasing little tropic birds and just grabbing them in the air and shaking them until they drop. It's not something that gives you a lot of sympathy for these animals. But as I said, it's something in them that's been quite overstated. Because the other side of frigate birds is their incredible frailty. What you see here, this is a female frigate bird, an adult female, and this is the young one. That young one you're seeing there is about as old as the one in the previous picture, but he's still being fed, which is very unusual for a bird. The one in the previous picture could fly perfectly, could harass other birds, but they actually remain dependent on their mothers for almost 2 years after they learn to fly, which is the longest period in any bird for that kind of dependency. Oops, skipped. And that's because it's a really hard job being a frigate bird. As I said, the kleptoparasitism is a very small part of their their diet, actually. Most of their diet comes from flying fish, and they're so perfectly adapted to the air, they actually can't take off from the water or the land. So if you drop a frigate bird on the ground, it cannot fly, because its legs cannot allow it to get up into the air. Ditto for the water. So that means these birds have to be incredibly agile. And so a big thing you see with these young birds is they spend a huge amount of time playing and practicing their agility, which is a big part of when they're chasing other birds. They're honing those skills that are so necessary for their survival. And so you can think of that first 2 years of life almost like an apprenticeship, but they still have to be fed by their mother because the skill set necessary for such a way of life requires a huge amount of time. So despite having that kind of menacing bully figure to them, they're incredibly fragile, and that's due to the difficulty of what they really, of their lifestyle and the skill set needed for it. A bit less menacing, though, are another related group of the Placaniforms. This is a red-footed booby, and boobies are related to the gannets of the northern hemisphere. And they're these incredible living fish spears. So they plunge in like javelins into the water to catch fish. This is a brown booby, and this is a masked booby, which is the largest species on Laysan. And you notice something interesting? They don't have nostrils. And that's because when they're plunging maybe from 10 meters up into the water, they don't want water just to go shooting up their nose. So they've actually gotten rid of nostrils altogether. And inside their skull, they've got all these air pockets actually to cushion themselves from the below. Which means if you ever pick up a booby, if you have to, it's a good idea. You have to actually stick your finger into the bill, because if you were to hold the bill shut, they'd actually suffocate. So it's sort of an interesting adaptation. And like the frigate birds, it shows that all these birds, how far they have to go to make a living at what they do. That the modifications that have had to happen to their bodies are immense. Another cool thing about frigate birds, when they're incubating their eggs, not frigate birds, boobies, unlike most birds which have a little patch of skin that's bare for eggs, these guys actually use their feet. So when a booby is incubating, they stick their big webbed feet over the egg to keep it warm. It's kind of cool. And the last member of the Placaniforms is the most graceful and the smallest, and that's the tropic bird. They're the spectacular birds. They're red-tailed tropic birds. You see they have these beautiful red streamers and that fire-engine red bill. And like the frigate birds, they're incredibly clumsy on land. Their feet are way back on their bodies for swimming, so they actually can't walk. But they're a beautiful creature. They've been compared almost to an Egyptian god. They have that beautiful bit of black hieroglyphics around the face there. This is a tropic bird who lived under my porch, so just underneath my tent pretty much. And I watched him grow up for about 2 months. So finally I saw him just before I left as an adult bird just before he went off into the sea. So I got to share a pretty fun time with him. I named him Mervyn after Mervyn Peake, who is quite a whimsical novelist. The final group of seabirds are the terns. And these are close cousins to gulls, so they're a group that should be familiar to most of us. Gulls are almost absent from tropical oceans, though. So when you get to the tropics, that group is almost totally represented by the terns. So these guys are black noddies, and they're a very abundant bird on Laysan. And this is the brown noddy, very similar. You can see there how they got their name. This sort of nodding behavior of theirs is part of their courtship. And these are one of the most willfully eccentric birds I've ever encountered. But I don't really have too much time to go into that here, because I could do a whole presentation on brown noddies. Most ethereal of all the birds on Laysan would be the white fairy tern. As you can see, I mean, it bears no description, those massive black eyes, that flawless plumage like coral sand. And these are really one of the most endearing and lovely birds to spend time with. They're a bit funny because they don't actually build nests. So they'll lay their eggs in the weirdest, most precarious places, like on top of a stick, or you put like a PVC pole and there'll be a tern laying an egg on it. And as you can see, this baby's feet are huge. They're about as big as its body. And that's because its parents have plunked it on something that it can't support itself on unless it's got these giant feet that extend all around. Pretty cute. This is a grayback tern, a fairly common tern on Laysan. And something just to quickly note, all these birds, they seem pretty similar, right? We've got 3 kinds of albatross, 3 kinds of booby, whole bunches of terns. And yet each of these birds will have a slightly different role in the marine ecosystem. So each kind of booby takes a slightly different kind of fish, and a slightly different size of fish. Laysan albatrosses eat a lot of squid, and they have a lot of the chemical rhodopsin in their eyes, which allows them to see in the dark, whereas black-footed albatrosses are more diurnal and end up eating a lot of flying fish eggs. These guys, for some reason, eat a lot of cowfish babies. And a cowfish is a spiky little armored animal with poison spines. So for some funny reason, that's a big part of their diet. And that's just a good reminder that to all these birds, the ocean looks somewhat different. All of them have an incredible toolkit for getting food from the ocean, and yet they're all getting slightly different information. An eddy or an upwelling means something different to this guy that does to a closely related tern who's going after a slightly different kind of fish. To an albatross, they might be looking for a scent of a dead whale or something, whereas a frigate bird might be watching for a big group of tuna who are pushing fish to the surface. So the ocean ecosystem is entirely different when seen through the eyes of different birds. This little guy is a sooty tern. And the sooty tern is one of the most abundant birds on planet Earth. And they're also probably one of the most aerial. These birds, unlike most seabirds, have no waterproofing on their feathers. So if they landed on the ocean, they'd very rapidly get waterlogged and sink. So despite being entirely dependent on it, they actually can't even really touch it. However, they don't touch land for the first 5 years after they leave the nest. So these birds wander across the oceans without ever touching water pretty much, or touching land for 5 whole years. So they're almost entirely animals of the air. This seems like a fiction or a fairy tale that they can do that. And there's not like an albatross either. It's not like they can soar. They're only about this big. There's one at the front there, right over there. And so it's just incredible they do that. And they're one of the most abundant birds on Laysan. So this just reeling mass of terns here is just one slight sliver of the actual size of that flock. So at any given time, there are literally hundreds of thousands of these birds hovering over Laysan. So despite the challenges they face, they've been astonishingly successful. So that brings us to the seabirds. And now we're on to another dependent bird of Laysan. And these birds that live on Laysan all year round are in some ways the polar opposite of the seabirds. The seabirds have this vast global range that all gets sort of siphoned into the island of Laysan. These guys have some of the most constricted range of any animal on Earth. This is the Laysan finch, and they were the only native songbirds to survive when Laysan became denuded. And when you meet a Laysan finch, you quickly realize why. They're incredibly resourceful, incredibly inquisitive. Any animal is going to survive their home being reduced to just a white sand desert. It's going to be these guys. They can eat albatross eggs when they need to, and there is no plant on Laysan I didn't see these guys eating. So it's pretty much their garden. They're incredibly inquisitive. You put down a cup of coffee, within seconds, Laysan finch is drinking out of it. So they're these sort of characters, these little imps of the island. This bird here is a miller bird. I don't know who that is. They, as I said, the Laysan finch was the only songbird to survive. So there was a Laysan miller bird and it got wiped out. But there's a neighboring island called Nihoa, which has a very closely related miller bird, the Nihoa miller bird. In the last few years, they transplanted some individuals from Nihoa to Laysan. So for the first time in about a century, these guys are found once again on the island, which is one of the most beautiful things that the service is doing, is a gradual restoration of the island to what it once was. It also gives a valuable second population in case the Nihoa population runs into trouble. And these guys, they're actually a kind of old world warbler. So they're a group of birds that are found entirely in the old world, and they're the only representative of those guys in the Hawaiian Islands. So you can imagine this incredible long history that maybe these guys got blown out there millions of years ago and have been living and surviving on these remote rocky atolls ever since. Totally the opposite scenario from the wandering from the journeying albatross. So if you hear the song of a miller bird, it sounds very similar to a marsh wren, which is a kind of bird around here, which sounds kind of like a sewing machine or something. It's this kind of harsh little stuttering staccato sound. But it was pretty amazing to sit there with a couple of people working with these birds and hear that song and know I was the only person on planet Earth at that time listening to that song. These guys, the Laysan duck, are an incredibly charming creature. This one's a male, and that's a female. And they're the second rarest duck on Earth. There's only 250 of them on Laysan, which is up from the 12 that were left at the beginning of the 20th century. So they are recovering. and they were just a really charming presence to have on the island. Another bird that is endemic to Laysan, though some have been moved to Midway, where they never used to live, just to have a secondary population there. So that covers all the birds that breed on Laysan, but there's a final group that visit there, and these are the shorebirds. This is a bristle-flied curlew, and they actually breed in southwestern, or actually in far west of Alaska. And they spend their summers there in the Arctic tundra, and then at the end of the summer, they do this incredible jump where they fly for 4,000 kilometers straight, right across the ocean to land on this little coral speck of Laysan, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. An albatross can do that, but if they miss the island, it's no big problem. They're in their element. The ocean is their environment. For these guys, the ocean is entirely hostile. They can't land on it. They can't feed from it. And so their awareness of where they're going, their accuracy has to be pinpoint. You know, you can imagine just the slightest differing from that trajectory and they'd just be over open ocean. And so it's a pretty incredible thought that these guys can just make that journey, flying straight day and night from Alaska to the tropical Pacific. This guy's another shorebird. There were a lot, but why I wanted to emphasize this one, the golden plover, is I actually saw a few of these guys a couple weeks ago just in Boundary Bay. So this is a bird like the black-footed albatross and Laysan albatross that includes us in the Laysan story. This bird would have bred in Alaska. I saw one a few weeks ago, and anyone can see them around here, just in Boundary Bay. And right now that bird may well be on Laysan or Midway or Hawaii. So it's a pretty amazing reminder. We think about that we've recently invented globalization, that we've suddenly made the world a smaller place. And yet these animals have included BC in this incredibly wider story for millennia, and that our ecosystem and our region here extends all the way for thousands of kilometers out in the open ocean, which is a pretty sobering and pretty humbling thought. Laysan, in addition to birds, is also an unparalleled place for marine life. So this is the Hawaiian monk seal. That's a little baby Hawaiian monk seal. This is one of the very rarest and most endangered marine mammals on the planet. There's only 1,100 of them left on Earth, and they are actually declining by about 4% every year. Laysan is the second most important breeding spot for them on the planet, and they're entirely confined to the Hawaiian Islands. So being able to see and be around these guys was a pretty amazing privilege, though sometimes they were a little bit intimidating. I remember one time I went down to wash dishes in the lagoon after dinner, and I looked up and I had a monk seal staring into my face. So they're very inquisitive, and they're a really amazing presence. And their survival in Laysan reflects just how rich a marine environment it is. So this is just a site of snorkeling around Laysan, and as I said, it's got about 3 times the biomass of fish of the Hawaiian Islands, and where that's concentrated is in predators. So this is a big alua, or giant trevally. One of those actually grabbed my entire hand in its mouth and left puncture marks all the way around. So they can be a bit of a thug, but what's astonishing about the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands is in the main Hawaiian Islands, about 3% of the biomass, so the amount of animals in the ocean, are top predators like this guy, apex predators. In the Northwesterns, 50%. So half the sheer weight of animals in Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are top predators like the jacks and like this white-tipped reef shark here, which is an incredible statement about just how healthy an ecosystem that is. You can imagine in other places we fish the predators out, we sort of assume that there shouldn't be these animals around. They should be rare because we've made that the case. But you travel to a pristine protected area like that, and you just see how rich the environment can be and what a huge population of these spectacular, charismatic megafauna they can really support. So I spoke sort of, I don't know, kind of whimsically about Laysan as the heart of the Pacific in the title of my talk. And of course that's kind of literally true, in this way it's about halfway into the Pacific, like it's in the middle. But there's also a further meaning of that to which I want to emphasize. So Laysan albatrosses, they leave Laysan and go about here. So they forage off the coast of Alaska and Japan and Siberia, and a few end up down here. Blackfoots largely forage here. They leave Laysan and go to the coast of North America, and go down all the way down to about central California. The little wedge-tailed shearwaters, those little caterwaulers at night, feed off the coast of Central America a lot. And then frigate birds and thistly terns will be going down to the coast of Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, and Asia. And little bone-in petrels will be going around about here. And then a bunch of them also hang around there. And what you may notice from what I've just done is that the birds from Laysan do an entire circuit, pretty much, of the ocean. So you can imagine, as a human heart works, right? It's tiny, it's a tiny part of your body, and yet it's sending blood to every portion of your body. The blood returns and gets oxygenated. If you want to extend that metaphor a bit more, these birds that wander across the endless vastness of the Pacific, in order to reproduce, in order to create a next generation, they all have to return to their island which they were born, in this case, Laysan. And so you can think of Laysan, though it's this tiny, tiny speck, as performing the function of a human heart. These birds, as they disperse to the entire body of the Pacific, return, create more, and those young ones in turn disperse across the Pacific. So though tiny, you can imagine how important your heart is to you. It's a similar thing. Without that island there would be a huge silence that would descend across this vast area. Good to remember. So what were we doing on Laysan? I described quite how spectacular it is to me, but how did we get the privilege of that? I mean, we were just watching sunsets, so that was a great bench on which to do it from. We were there working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and as I said, Laysan has had a pretty raw deal when it's come to people. Huge damage at the beginning of the 20th century, and our job was to some extent to try and reverse and mitigate that damage. So Laysan has a beautiful collection of native plants. This is a capris flower, one of the loveliest smelling flowers I've ever encountered. And one of our big things was helping restore vegetation, which was twofold. We had to remove invasives, so people over the last 100 years have introduced tons of invasive plants to this delicate island ecosystem, and they wreak a lot of havoc and destroy a lot of nesting area for the birds. And because of that, actually, Laysan's a quarantine island. So everything we brought to Laysan had to be bought new. I couldn't bring underwear or any clothes to Laysan that hadn't first been frozen and bug bombed and exposed to all sorts of quarantine. And that's to ensure that no seeds, nothing, makes it to the island that shouldn't be there. So we removed a huge amount of this, the Puki indica, about 35,000 of these plants. And we also did a lot of cultivation of the native plants. So this beautiful plant here, the Chenopodium, or goosefoot, and this red-footed booby here is making a nest in it. So we were restoring the island to what it was. For me, a very dear friend of mine, I first met him when he suffered a severe head trauma. In fact, he was recovering from a fairly mild form of brain damage. And it was very interesting, as I got to know him better, he was actually slowly becoming more like himself. As I got to know him better, his own internal traits were slowly returning to him. It's sort of a similar thing with Laysan. Over the last 100 years, she's been changing to resemble what she was. There's been this slow return, like a face emerging. And that I know the plants I planted there, the plants I removed from there, was this extra little bit to restore that face. And maybe in 100 years, Laysan will be almost identical to what she was 150 years ago. So to have that feeling of as I was experiencing this island, the island was, by my experience, becoming more like how it should be, was quite astonishing. We also tried to keep track of the ducks. So we're out there surveying the Laysan ducks. As I said, there's only 250 of these guys left on the island. And so you can imagine if there was a disease that came along, or if they were facing any kind of population decline, that would happen very quickly. And we were sort of like an early response team. We were keeping a very close eye on them. And if we knew, if that data was showing that they were declining, then they might have to take some action. What they're doing here is their main feeding style. This is a mom and her two ducklings. And they like to go by the lake to eat the brine flies, which is this big cloud here. And they put their noses on the ground and run along like mini vacuum cleaners to scare all the brine flies into the air, and then they feast on them. So she's actually teaching her babies sort of the classic Laysan duck feeding strategy. And so to walk along the lakeside of Laysan is to see all these little ducks shooting around like vacuum cleaners pretty much around your feet, which is pretty charming. But I think one of the things, the way in which the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands have most come into people's consciousness is the question of garbage. They're close to what's been called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is where the currents form this slow-moving gyre. So they're in an area of the ocean that actually gathers a lot of the garbage that comes from other parts of the planet. And so you can see here the little young black-footed albatross, and he's just surrounded with bottles and trash that have washed up on the shores of Laysan. And unfortunately, these can be surprisingly destructive. So this little eel trap here seems innocuous, but because monk seals are so inquisitive, they stick their noses in there and actually get trapped. And you can imagine when you've got 1,100 of these seals left, every one that you lose is an incredible blow to the population. So the garbage can cause a really terrible effect. And unfortunately, there was very little we could do about it. The sheer volume of it could not be brought off the island by any of the boats that we had. So the best we could do is just this: move it up the shore, try and secure it above the high tide line, and ideally it wouldn't get into the water and entangle animals anymore. And once it was up there, it was kind of unsightly, but you know, the birds appreciated having a perch, as this little fairy tern does, and you know, maybe she could even try and lay an egg there. No. However, the most insidious way that garbage was coming to the island was not coming in with the tides, coming with the birds. So this is a story that I'm glad to say is gaining a lot of traction. Many of you, if not all of you, may have actually heard this story before, but I'll run through it again. So these again are our two main Laysan albatrosses, the spectacular Blackfoot and the Laysan. And one of the really cool things about being there was seeing this and variations of that. This is their breeding season, so they were raising their babies on the island, and the bond between the Laysan albatross and their young is really incredible to see. They recognize their young instantly out of hundreds of thousands of babies, even if they haven't seen their baby, you know, in 3 months or 3 weeks when they've been foraging on the ocean. And so you see, when you're just sitting on the beach of Laysan, a Laysan albatross come in off the sea, and maybe she's been foraging around Alaska or BC, and she'll just make a beeline for this one chick, plunk down, go over, groom it, and then feed it. And one of the loveliest things about albatrosses, probably my favorite fact, period, is they actually talk to their eggs. When they're sitting on the eggs, they actually do these little squeaks to them. No one really knows where that is. There's some thought that the baby in the egg hears that and actually learns its parents' individual voice, so they can recognize each other when the parent's coming in off the ocean. But I think just the sheer image of this devoted parental animal, I mean, they will spend 3 weeks on their egg without eating or drinking anything just to keep it warm. During that time, is doing these little gentle squeaks to their egg. Is one of the more beautiful facts about planet Earth. And then what you generally see after that, this little lovely greeting, is the adult throws up all this delicious stomach oil into the baby's mouth. And you can imagine these guys don't have any hands or arms. They're not carrying grocery bags. Any food that baby gets is coming from the adult's belly. So this is the fundamental ritual for baby albatrosses. They wait for 3 weeks, their parent comes in, feeds them, and then leaves. And this is kind of the result of that. So this is an albatross bolus, and it's sort of like an owl pellet. They throw out the indigestible parts of their food, and this one is mainly squid beaks. So all these little hooked things are actually the beaks of squid. So the Laysan albatross gave her baby all these squid, they digested everything but the beak. But you can see these little pieces of plastic in there. That's actually the bolus I found with the least plastic. Many of the ones I saw were entirely plastic. So there's something I want to hand around to you, actually. I'm going to take this and hand it out. I'm sure it's focused here. And all that bag contains is plastic that has come from the bellies of albatrosses. So I collected it on Laysan, and you can open it up, take it out. You'll find toothbrushes in there and combs and lighters, things that are very familiar to us here. And these are things that are tossed away, and albatrosses are looking for food on the surface of the ocean. And for the vast majority of their history, if it's been floating on the surface of the ocean, it's been edible. It's been a little piece of whale blubber or something like that. And so they're adapted to pick those up. And of course, they have no idea how potentially toxic or destructive they can be to their young. So this is actually the skeleton of a dead baby albatross. And you can see inside the body cavity, it's just riddled with plastic. One of the amazing things we were watching was these guys growing up. So in the 4 months I was there, these guys went from these little tiny bundles of fluff to these really handsome fellows here shedding the last of their mutton chops. One of, I think, the most magical things I've ever seen is watching these guys as they practice flying. So whenever a stiff wind came through the albatross colony, all the young, towards the end of the breeding season, would raise their wings and start flapping them in the wind in this incredible anticipation of that vast exploratory life that awaited them. I frequently saw this, though. So this little guy isn't going anywhere. He's almost ready. He's lost almost all of his baby down. These wings are huge. He's got the return on the investment of all those months of fish oil, he didn't make it. There were hundreds of albatross babies that didn't make it. And obviously that happens in nature. Nature is tough on babies. And there's always going to be animals that don't survive. But in many of the young we found, their stomach cavities were just full of plastic. And you can imagine that if the parents are bringing the plastic back and not squid, I mean, it doesn't take too much logic to figure that out. Exactly. And of course, even if they do make it out of the colony, you're not seeing what longer-term effect that plastic might have. The chemicals in there, they're leaching into their bodies. We don't fully understand the long-term effect on these birds. So it's pretty amazing as you're looking at that plastic that's being handed around to think about the journey it's undergone. Someone tossed it away, ended up in the ocean, ended up in the body of an adult albatross who found it maybe in the North Pacific, brought it across thousands of kilometers to a baby, and now, after that baby has died, it's come back across the sea, back to us. The line here is from William Blake. It's every tear from every eye becomes a babe in eternity. And he was using it in a more, I think, profound or metaphysical context than I am. But I'm using it as to sort of illustrate the point that every action of ours has a life outside of us. That, in his case, he uses the idea that a tear goes on and lives outside of us. In this case, whoever tossed away that comb or that lighter, it was just a thought, it was a second. There was no malice towards albatrosses or anything else. And yet that action lived on and still lives on. That action passed across thousands of kilometers of ocean through the bodies of seabirds and has passed back to us. So it brings home that idea that our impact goes far beyond what we understand, and even the smallest actions have wide-reaching consequences. As I said, I think this is a story that a lot of people become aware of. There's the film Midway coming out, which really deals with the idea of plastic and albatrosses, I think, really stridently, which is wonderful. But the image of a dead baby albatross on the beach is not what I want to leave you with, because that is not the dominant feeling I got from Laysan, and that really isn't what I feel is the most way cool thing, or the thing that I want to share. What was quite incredible at Laysan is because these birds, in their long history until now, have never really encountered humans, they're without fear of us. And so when you interact with the birds of Laysan, you're interacting with a bird that is incredibly interested in and curious about you. So if you were to sit down on the beach, this almost always would happen. They were like toddlers. They'd look up at you in those beautiful black eyes and just walk over to you. They'd start kind of tenderly caressing your arm, pulling your shirt, untying your shoes, and just looking at you. Because this is an animal that has seen, the northern lights shining over icebergs, has seen breaching humpback whales and incredible sights across the Pacific, and yet you are the most amazing thing it's seen that day. You still fascinate it. And so there's almost an eidetic quality with spending time with these birds because they're interested in you and you're fascinating to them. And so to spend time in Laysan is to be able to be interacting with these animals in a really intimate way. As I said, these guys are brats, so you'd have to try and keep them out of your tent. They'd fly in and go through your stuff. One day they got into the kitchen tent, they took all of our jelly beans, which was, you can't get any more. It was really quite a sore blow. Yeah, these little scamps were just everywhere. And the ethereal fairy terns would just follow you. So if you were up for a walk, you'd look up behind you, you'd have maybe 2 or 3 of these birds just hovering over you. If you stopped, they'd sort of come down to your eye level and just examine you. There was that innocent fascination. I mean, these are animals that encounter novel or strange things all the time. So they have this natural curiosity to understand. And occasionally even alight on you. So this is my arm there. So I just raised my hand and this beautiful sea spirit just came right down and lived there. Pretty amazing. But I think you've been very patient, so I'm wrapping up now. Beyond even that incredible privilege of having animals interested in you, I think the most fundamental thing was the ability to be invisible. That I could walk among breeding seabirds or finches or ducks, and it was like I wasn't even there. These are some of the wildest animals on Earth. It's not that they're tame, it's that their wildness actually insulates them from us. And so I got the chance to observe all these intimate stages in their lives. The raising of their young. This is a baby frigate bird here. There's a couple of mass boobies with their chick. The raising of their young, And then, of course, the intimate rituals of their interpersonal life. So these incredible dances of the albatrosses, which for them are cementing those bonds that they'll carry for 60, 70, 80 years in this incredible long-term story between these two. And that's something, as someone who loves watching wildlife and animals here, is not a gift I've often been able to have. Usually when you see an animal here, it's trying to get away from you. It's hiding its life from you. And so to be able to look into their lives and see them not as populations or as sort of generic creatures, as individuals with these incredible stories, these incredible lives they were living, that I was privy to. So you often saw these albatrosses here, like these two here, just these incredibly tender caresses. They're very powerful bills, they can shred a squid, and you'd see them so often just caressing each other's cheeks or their throats. Probably my favorite thing I saw was with these blackfoots. And these are actually two juvenile birds. So they haven't yet bred, but they were playing house. So they'd come to the island and they built a mock nest. So they would bring each other little flowers to put in the nest and decorating it and creating that. And then maybe in 2 or 3 years, they'll have cemented those skills well enough to actually produce young. So that is something I've never seen anywhere else on Earth, to see those intimate moments between these incredibly complex and fascinating animals. That was the biggest gift of Laysan, but also a reminder that it's not just air. So this is a line from John Milton, and it's, "Nor think, though men were none, that heaven would want spectators. Millions of spiritual creatures walk the earth, unseen, both when we wake and when we sleep. Both day and night, how often from the steep, echoing hill or thicket have we heard celestial voices to the midnight air, soul, or responsive each to other's note." So Milton here is talking about angels, to be fair, but I think the translation works for albatrosses. But in general, Laysan isn't special because of the kinds of birds that are there. It's special because of the clarity one can have there, because they trust you. They show you windows into these lives. Those lives are going on all around us. Here in Vancouver, there are about 200 kinds of birds that use this area all throughout the year. Some, like the golden plover or the black-footed albatross, will continue that story onto Laysan. And I guarantee you, your garden, the parks you visit, your neighborhood is as central to their lives, has those same stories that Laysan does. We know that many songbirds will return after thousands of kilometer journeys from South America to the exact spot, the exact little woodlot or little vacant lot or field that they were the year before. They have these incredible complex relationships, like is clearly observable in these albatrosses. It's harder to see. It's harder to notice that because it's hidden from us. And so for me, Laysan was not the sole example of this principle that Milton outlines. It was the clarification of that. It was a place where the water was clear so I could see it. But a reminder that that principle is everywhere, and that wherever we live, we are tangled in the lives of some incredible creatures, and it can be scary. It can be scary because that means our actions matter. It means everything we do matters. And it's frightening, as we can see in the case of plastic, that our influence extends far beyond ourselves. But I think that's the same fear as when someone hands you a baby, right? It's the fear that, wow, I could drop this. This is precious. It's the fear that comes from realization of value. It's a fear that is actually just the other face of love. And so, for me, Laysan was a clarification and distillation of that principle, which I hope to bring for the rest of my life. And hopefully, through this presentation for you, it's done in a small way a similar thing. Thanks.